Thank you very much. In the context of looking at a new social contract, it's very useful to say, what might we be contracting to do? And ultimately, if you say, well, the human being should be somewhere near the center of this, obviously the planet and the environment are important, but we're also important. What might be the content of the things we would contract to do as part of a new social contract, for sustainability for the world that is coming? So I wanted to summarize briefly some things I've been doing in a few research projects in the last few years on some dimensions of that, starting with a little bit of, might be an ethical basis for the social contract. What are some of the fundamental principles that should underlie such a social contract? And then some work I've been doing with the World Bank on indicators of individual development, and with an EU-funded project, indicators for individual values. So they're complementary ways of looking at from the individual level, the individual human being, what might be involved in this social contract. And I say, first with the ethical basis, we could probably say that justice in general should be the foundation of any social contract. If it's not just, that's sort of one of the foundational values of society, civilization, all the rest of it. And it's clear that people aren't going to support development projects if they don't see that they're just and equitable. I mean, if you say, you have to stay poor because I want to stay rich, and we're going to destroy the environment if I stop being rich, people aren't going to agree. It's unjust. Even dogs believe in justice. You give one dog a bigger reward for something, the other one, then the second dog won't do the trick again because he didn't get the same reward as the other dog. So justice is a really foundational principle of society. And if we don't have the commitment of people, then we're not going to have implementation. People aren't going to implement things that they aren't supporting. So it's really fundamentally, all these declarations are no good if they're not supported by people. People don't believe in them and don't see that they're going to benefit from the process. And as John Rawls, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, and laws and institutions must be reformed or abolished if they're unjust. And the rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or the calculus of social interest. I think this is really, it's sort of, if you have to stop somewhere, the book stops at the principle of justice. That's the foundational to the rest. I think also in a globalized world, we have to accept that the primacy of the oneness of humanity, that if we say we're all a single human race, then each person is born as a trust of the whole, and we all have a responsibility for the welfare of every single human being. And this collective trusteeship is the moral foundation of human rights, development policy, sustainability. It's really the foundation of everything. And today, in a globalized world, the welfare of each country or community can only be derived from the well-being of the whole planet. We're all in this together. It's like the Titanic. We're all going to sink together, or we're going to sit together. So these are foundational principles for any new contract. But I think also we ought to think then, therefore, that the purpose of development should be to create such a new social order that ultimately allows us to cultivate the limitless potentialities latent in human consciousness. Because growth materially can't go on forever. We're hitting limits of growth in material things, but you might say the intangible dimensions of the human being in culture, in science, in creativity, in art, and so on and so forth, those are things that can grow forever. And those are things that come from our human consciousness, from our higher human powers. And therefore the real purpose should be focusing on that dimension of civilization rather than the material dimension. And therefore the ultimate function of economic systems should be to give us the means to achieve that purpose. It's a means. Economics is a means, not an end in itself, not accumulating wealth for accumulating wealth. And where we're creating wealth, yes, we need that, but it should be to enrich everybody. It should be making everybody wealthy and not just creating wealth that is concentrated in your tiny minority of elite, the rich and powerful. So we need, therefore, to look at the values behind our economic system, our economic models, saying that they should be, if there's sort of design principles for a new economy, that it should be dynamic, just, and thriving social order should be its purpose, that is strongly altruistic and cooperative in nature, provides meaningful employment, which is a big failing in the system today, and helps eradicate poverty in the world. I think those should be the ultimate purposes of any economic system that we create as part of this new social contract. And acknowledging that with all that we've done with technology, that it's unjust to use these technological breakthroughs to make privileged minorities, go ahead while everybody else is left behind. So then, I was asked last year by the World Bank to come up with a concept for a new development index based on the individual human being, which was an exercise that was not easy. So where do you start from? Well, you've got the Declaration of Human Rights. If you don't have those, you can't develop as a human being. You've got everything from Maslow's pyramid, through to various, scriptural interpretations of what is the human being, and so on. And I tried to distill out of that obviously we have to focus on the poor, because that comes out of the Brundtland Commission, that the absolute priority given to the poor, eliminating poverty. But GDP doesn't measure that. I mean, GDP is the total economy. And the poorer you are, the less you count in GDP statistics. You just sort of drop off the measuring screen. So these aggregate statistical measures hide, all of those who are not part, those who aren't benefiting from the present social contract. They're not being captured by our present sets of indicators, and we therefore can easily ignore them. Subsistence activities and women's work in the home, they just don't enter into GDP at all. And yet it's the weakness in individual human capacity to create wealth, to innovate, to collaborate, to manage, to build strong families and communities that are the primary barriers to effective development. If we can work at that level, we can say, are we really advancing in meeting what we're contracting with human race to try to achieve with this contract? And so again, in this context, then, the purpose of development should be to improve the prosperity and well-being of each individual person, not raising GDP, not increasing the total mass and function of the economy, but how well is our country, our society, helping each human being to fulfill, their own human potential and to, accomplish their lives as human beings. That would be the best fundamental measure of success in development. And what we need then are what kind of indicators might be used at that level to measure how well we're advancing towards the development of human beings. And so, as I mentioned with the World Bank, I tried to come up with identifying different dimensions of individual development for which there might be indicators. And you could indicators in terms of percentage of population, or what are the laws and institutions and processes that can help individuals to achieve that dimension. So you may not be able to directly measure the result, but what is government doing to facilitate the process, making it easier or more difficult for an individual to develop one particular dimension of their lives? And then I'll come back to the values-based indicators at the latter part of the presentation. So these were some dimensions of development and some possible indicators that could be used to measure progress in some new way. So obviously the first dimension of development is our physical growth and health. We are human beings with physical bodies who have physical needs, and if you're sick or undernourished or so on, you're not able to develop. So I went through a list, to say, from various sources of what are the dimensions of physical growth and development, everything from food and nutrition to adequate shelter, housing, or clean, unpolluted environment, care for the elderly, and so on, and try to say, what are some of the indicators that might help to capture this? Well, you might say, what are healthcare provisions for the birth of a child? Or do we have access to primary health care for everyone? What does it cost, and is it physically available? Is there adequate child nutrition? Does the government ensure that every child is adequately fed, in every circumstance? And do they have, basically some things like the Millennium Goals on water and sanitation? But also, for instance, as a person gets old, if they have no family, is there some way to take care of them, in their old age? Similarly, there are other dimensions of material welfare, where you might measure the number of homeless peoples, or whether they have access to on or off-grid electricity, have basic energy needs for cooking, different kinds of indicators that might be within reach that would capture some dimensions of this. In the same way, looking at security and safety as another dimension, these, of course, are things that we've looked at for a long time, everything from freedom from crime, corruption, security from military action, and so on. And then, can you get insurance against some kind of disasters? It's one dimension of providing a certain security and safety. Or how well does the government manage toxic chemicals to protect the public from the risks of these dangerous materials? Is there legal protection? What causes premature deaths? Different kinds of indicators that might capture the dimension security and safety. Education, of course, is fundamental to each individual's development, and it takes a variety of forms at different times in life. And so you can find a number of indicators that might relate to education. Does every child have access to school? What's involved in enrolling your girl child, in primary education? What is the percentage of girls and boys in school in urban and rural areas? What about functional literacy? A number of indicators that might capture in one way or another the progress or the potential, the success in achieving education. Work is another dimension of individual human development. So all those things that can facilitate a person to being trained, to have an employment, to earn a proper living from that employment, to get things, everything from a bank account to legal services, or to defend a contract that's not been. All of those things are part of making work possible, and so you might mention the pressure part of the population working in the cash or subsistence economy, the informal sector, the illegal sector, which is a very important one, even if we don't always measure it. The non-wage work. What about legislation or government assistance? Each of these could capture some dimension of facilitating each individual's capacity to work. Of course, the financial system is critical to development. We often think about it in those terms, but what about protecting the real value of your money from inflation? You've saved up for old age and suddenly it's not worth anything for the no fault of your own. Or a money supply that you can actually convert and exchange and use in some reasonable way. Are you protected from theft or unlawful dispossession, kidnapping, piracy, and so on? All of these are dimensions of that. And so you might find indicators of how easy it is to buy a residence, to open a savings account. Can you pay your taxes easily and honestly? Do you experience corruption? Does government provide certain social security? And so on. Each of these could be measures of the individual, what's the government doing to facilitate individual dimension of development. Justice and fairness, just as I mentioned, is critical to the individual, and therefore, do you have recognition before the law? Is there a legal remedy? Is there a low level of income inequality? Is the Gini coefficient showing that you're not getting extremes of wealth, which is very much unjust? Is there mobility, fair taxation? Each of these might be dimensions of how justice is applied at the individual level. And so you can have indicators that relate to that, like having an official household address, which is not always evident in certain countries, or what is involved in getting married. Is your marriage actually recognized legally? Can you get a passport and travel? Human rights and freedoms, there's not time to go into detail, but each of those is a significant dimension of development. And so you can measure, what at least does government provide of protecting freedom of speech, or freedom of thought, or conscience or religion, the right to privacy, the right to own property, to take part in government and to vote. Each of them could become indicators at the individual level of their taking part in society and experiencing those rights and freedoms. Then you might say the higher levels of organization, the place in the community, where do you have some personal status and dignity? Do you have social networks you can count on? Marriage and family, a community that respects public order, where there's trust and reciprocity, mobility, the ability to move around. So the whole process of community life, because we're not individual human beings only, we're parts of communities, and we need to have the dimensions of development that are related to our community life. And those number of indicators can then capture that through recognition of personal status, the levels of community trust, ability to register to vote, attaining internet access or access to public transportation. Each of those can also show how you're part of the community. And then you might say, ultimately, cultural and spiritual identity. Can you choose your own cultural identity and your own heritage? Do you have some kind of value systems and beliefs and ethics and morals on which you found your life? Have a vision and purpose in life? Can you develop your potential for consciousness, participate in arts and culture, have access to nature and to beauty? And there are now these indicators of overall evaluative well-being or life satisfaction or happiness. They're actually now beginning to find ways that you can determine how people see, how successful their life has been and whether they feel they've accomplished something in their life. So some of those indicators, again, can be identified in the presence of these things, or the opportunity to participate in certain kinds of activities, or these, as I mentioned, these overall indicators of well-being or satisfaction. One critical issue that I just want to flag briefly, of course, is that so much of our individual responsibility, potential is related to your citizenship. If you're born in America, your rights are very different. If you're born in India, now is that something where you're stuck within those borders, or does every human have a right no matter where they are in the world? Immigrants who leave their country, do they leave behind these rights? Can we guarantee this potential possible to develop no matter where they are? It addresses fundamental political issues, fundamental issues of xenophobia and rejection or being welcoming to immigrants, but it raises a whole set of issues about how well do we apply this potential for the individual to develop regardless of where they are in the world. And similarly, depending where your country's at different stages. Actually, your potential to develop if you're in Burkina Faso is not the same as if you are in Switzerland, and therefore you have to also be able to say, how do you adapt these indicators to the potential you are, and how well you can move from one stage of development to another, both individually and collectively. Now, very briefly, in the last 3 minutes that remain, I've also been working on values-based indicators, because not only do you have this more general level of individual developing, but what about the individual's own values, and how do they steer them towards their own path towards development and fulfillment as human beings? And we had an EU-funded project which selected a number of values related to sustainability, like respect for the environment, empowerment, appreciating unity and diversity, trustworthiness, integrity, justice, solidarity, moderation, and detachment of material things, and said, can we help people to measure for themselves how well their values correspond to, you might say, would be the ideal with respect to moving people on a path towards sustainability at the individual level. And we had a whole series of case studies with indigenous child soldiers in Sierra Leone, with school children in rural Mexican villages, even a control with a financial service company in Luxembourg, to help either the organization, the NGO working at values, or with the individual to see where they situate themselves and how they can perhaps improve their, make more coherent their own set of values. And these can be assessed through questionnaires, through various kinds of social science techniques. Very simple, is this important, not important? Or, for instance, I hug trees for spiritual strength, or trees inspire and refresh my spirit, or trees produce oxygen I breathe. They're a practical use. Or trees give me wood and paper, or trees are nice, but things are cleaner without them. Or when you've seen one tree, you've seen them all, to quote Ronald Reagan, for example. So you can have a spectrum. Where do you find yourself on that spectrum of that particular value? And so with respect to the environment, looking at how do you see yourself as part of the environment or separate from it? Well, I value the world as a source of personal fulfillment, or I purchase environmentally sustainable products, or I make recreation environmentally friendly. These are things people can say, where do I situate? What are my own values with respect to this? Or empowerment, I'm encouraged to grow personally, make potential. Others respect me, I respect them. I take risks, make me space, learn from my errors. Oh, I don't have to compromise my personal values or beliefs. You can find ways of feeling out into thing that you might call as empowerment, or appreciating unity and diversity. I listen to other people's points of view. I'm sure everybody's included in my group. I replace a negative feeling by a stronger positive feeling, or my community is richer because it is diverse. There are different ways you can sort of sound out and get and some kind of indicators for that dimension of society. Trustworthiness as well. I'm honest, I meet my obligations, I pay my taxes, I practice what I preach, I can be trustworthy people's Monday. You can, again, find ways of assessing that set of values related to justice and solidarity. I don't know what's right for myself. I don't listen to others. I help those less well for myself. I look at future generations. I support social causes. There are different ways you can say, well, how do I express justice and solidarity in terms of my own behavior, my own lifestyle? And then again, moderation. I only buy what I really need. I don't place importance on social status. I prefer to invest in social relationships rather than in material things. Or wealth can be a barrier to social development. Some of these things that can be used, again, to say, how do you, in a concrete way, say, these are behaviors or feelings that actually can be used, assessed to reflect these values at that level. So I think it is possible for us to say, as part of the social contract, or maybe behind it, that we can say we need to be focusing on human-centered development. We can develop new measures of development at the individual level that will help to change the focus from creating wealth, creating well-being in a spirit of justice and equity. We can use values-based indicators to make people conscious of their real desires and motivations and help them to build an emotional commitment to change in this direction. So it's not just scientific ideas, but really this is what I feel in my heart, I'm going to do it. And by getting the signaling right, we can begin to measure perhaps the implementation of a social contract for a just and sustainable society. So thank you very much. I had to go quickly through a lot of things, but you'll have the text afterward if you want to go into more detail. And then there are other references behind that we can take on the dialogue further. But I hope that's helped to give another sense of what could go into the social contract. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur.